Okay, can everyone see my screen and hear me? All right, great. Yeah, my pleasure to step in here. I apologize to anyone who is disappointed that you have to hear about grading instead of culturally relevant pedagogy from my colleague Dr. Mersey, who's phenomenal. Hopefully, we'll have another opportunity to bring him in. This what I'm going to talk a little bit about today, and there is a piece around culture. So at least the way that we frame this is trying to change that academic culture, and you're going to see through this idea of when we think about grading, what are we trying to do, right? And our notion that spoiler alert, right, is to shift away from selecting talent to developing talent. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the work that we've done in this space. And so what I mean by sort of selecting talent is, and I'm a big baseball guy, you can see it in my background here. Here's an example of radar guns, right, at a baseball game. And so we're sitting there to see who can throw the hardest, right? If you can't throw hard, you're probably unlikely to make it to the next level, right? And that's kind of what we sometimes are doing when we think about the way we assess people. And so what I'd like to see is a system, right, that's we're there working with students, and this grading piece is really as best we can representative of what students are actually learning, but we're there working along with them. So that's kind of the gist. So before we get into some of the work that my colleagues and I have done, let's get into the mindset, that mindset of grading, which again is not always the most exciting and sexy topic to talk about, but it's something that we all have to deal with. And I mentioned this before some of you jumped on. The reason I do this work is because I don't like this part of my job. It's one of the parts of my job that I, to be completely honest, detest. It's not a fun part. It can be very boring. So let's get our minds into this space right before we jump into the weekend here. So take a moment just to reflect on your own grading practices or practices that have been used with you when you were a student, if you can think back that far. And what I'm going to have you do is, in a second, I'm going to put some responses up, but what I'm leaning towards is what is the purpose behind these systems? So think about what you've used, what you've seen, and then what that purpose is. And we'll get into a quick Zoom response here. Just give you another 30 seconds or so. Okay, so as best as we can here, and some of you may have, for the first time, you're actually thinking about, wait, why do I do what I do in terms of grading, or why was that used with me? So let's think a little bit about, in short notice, I'm just thinking, just do a Zoom reaction. Go ahead and do the reaction. You can also pop something up in the chat if you want in terms of a reaction. I'll get that open here on my screen. But how many, when you started to think about this, you're trying to provide information for students to self-evaluate themselves, to evaluate and assess themselves? So go ahead, you can pop something in the chat, or you can put a little reaction on your image there of this is what you thought of when you started to think about it. So a few thumbs up there. Okay, great. All right, how many of you providing incentives for students to learn? Go ahead and add some checks up there again. All right, I'm quickly scrolling through, seeing some thumbs. How about documenting student performance for the purposes of evaluating the effectiveness of your own instructional programs that you have? A few. Not as many thumbs there. How about selecting, identifying, or grouping students for certain educational pathways or programs? If you assess for that reason. Not a lot of thumbs there. I see a crying face. Yeah. All right. These are all, by the way, responses that we've seen when surveying. And then finally, communicating achievement to other interested parties, including places where students might get jobs. So thinking about that GPA, if you will. Okay, a few thumbs there as well. Okay. Next question to get us into this mindset is to take a moment to now reflect on your own grading practices. And I have 3 questions that we'll be going through. How do you typically determine a student's grade in your classes? Is this similar or different to how you were graded as a student? And then that final question, which is always the same answer, but do you enjoy that? So take about 30 seconds to think about how you were assessed, how you currently assess, and the connections between those two. And then do you enjoy this process yourself? Okay, so in terms of how you typically determine student grades, how many of you use some sort of accumulation of points? Go ahead and do the same Zoom reaction if you want, or pop something in the chat. So I see some thumbs going up there. How many of you average something across a series of assignments, exams, tests, quizzes, things like that, and take an average? See a little bit there. How about best score from multiple attempts? See some. Okay. Whatever the default is on my learning management system is what you use. All right. Again, this is what we've seen. So I see some laughing faces, right? But this is reality. Something that I didn't put up on the screen, some other ideas that folks have used in their system. Again, I'm quickly scrolling through the images here. I see some thumbs up. Okay. All right. In all these different approaches you may have taken, is this similar or different to how you were graded? How many similar, just in terms of your own experiences as a student? And as you can guess, right, response to this is right. Many faculty just default to their own experiences that were successful for them, right? If the grading was working, why, if it's not broke, why fix it, right? I'm seeing some no's up there, right? We don't want to do that. So that's my next question, different. So I'm seeing those no's up there, right? And I like that people are stepping outside that box. And then somewhere sort of in the middle, maybe a combination of some of the stuff you've seen in the classes you've attended, some mix there. Okay. And then the final question, do you enjoy grading? I see people are using the no's and yeses. You can do that instead of the thumbs. Some smiley faces, some laughing. Yep. Again, it's very rare, and most of the people are going to respond to no. Can pop your reactions up if you'd like. Okay. So thank you for humoring me with these questions. Generally speaking, as I started off this presentation, grading is one of those where it's a grind. And oftentimes we can feel buried by it as well, because you want to give students things to do, but you have to assess those things. And so you can feel buried, feel like you need some help. You feel like, all right, well, you know what, maybe I just default to giving these big assignments. So I don't have to grade as many things, but then that impacts students' grades even more so. And that's not necessarily a good idea either. Reality is we always feel, at least I feel, like I'm constantly trying to push a boulder up a hill. And the reality is grading is just not fun. Those who do enjoy it, I apologize, but it's just not fun for me. And so there's some things that sort of tie. I know 500 points. Yes. I don't think I've ever given that high of an assignment. So there's some disturbing trends that are linked very closely to grading that we need to be aware of. And there's some more recent research in this. I didn't have time to update it last night. But this grading thing that we're doing and the impact it can have on students, right? It's generally showing limited or no improvement in terms of the learning that students are having. So this is coming out of like industry responses to like students are coming out not really being great critical thinkers. They don't have complex reasoning. Their writing skills are challenging. Does this have something to do with grading, right? And that's really what all these bullet points are here. Is can we connect this to grading in some way? High levels of anxiety, psychological stress, right, around grades, right? Because you need to achieve these great grades if you're going to get a good job, right? Increased use of like drugs to enhance our ability to achieve better, right? Because it's tied to that grade, right? And we don't want that to be occurring either. And that's another problem. And then this final one is huge for me. Seeing cheating as acceptable to be able to get a grade, right? All of this is tied back to the fact of like, why are we doing this to the students, right? Because they should be in the classroom to try to learn something. And if the end goal is just to get a good grade, then it's going to lead to many of these disturbing trends. And that's That's completely and utterly going against why we're doing this in the first place, to help students learn. So this might look familiar to some of you who use a traditional score-based grading, right? And for those who don't use it, I applaud you, right? This is easy, right? It's easy to be able to say, here's a homework assignment, you got a certain percentage. Here's a quiz, certain percentage. Here's a final exam, here's a certain percentage. And we tabulate it all and you get a final grade. And I always like to highlight, right, that a student comes out of a class with a B, right, assumes that they didn't learn 20% of the material. That doesn't mean it's the same 20% for each student. But then we look at a course name, we look at a grade, and we're like, okay, they understand this material, right? And it's really unclear as to what they actually learn. So what do these actually represent, these grades that we're giving students? Is it knowledge? Is it effort? Is it ability? Is it some combination of these things? Is it none of these things? What are we trying to demonstrate with these grades? And that's the question that we've been asking in our group. And so what we recognize is that these traditional score-based grading systems inherently fail to meet the conditions for sound assessment of student work and learning. So why is it still so prevalent, especially in STEM and in engineering? And here are the reasons. It's pretty straightforward. Tradition, right? So that's why I asked that question earlier. Are you using things like the way you were assessed? Because oftentimes we just default to the way that we were assessed because we were successful in that system. At least the majority of faculty were successful in that system. There's this international understanding of what these grades mean. So while not every country and every place in the world uses an ABCD system, they understand what an A means, right? And when you put it on a 100-point scale, people can understand what that score means. So it's internationally recognized. So why would we change that, right? Why would we want to do that? And we really haven't done a lot of work to really understand, manage, or improve these systems to suggest, right, that maybe we should make some changes. And you're going to see, even in this work that I'm doing, and we all know our grading system at ASU, even though I'm doing alternative stuff in my classroom, what do I ultimately have to do? I still have to default to the letter system because I can't change ASU's system, right? And so making a big change in these institutions that aren't necessarily set in their way, but have a system in place is a massive undertaking to be able to do this. Doesn't mean we can't do small things in our classroom. So we were encouraged, our team, and you're going to see a story that I'll tell here shortly, by a call for change that was driven by the U.S. Department of Education, which doesn't necessarily reach higher education as much as it does K-12. But generally speaking, this call, which is all the way back in 2006, was urged to improve and increase accountability to monitor student learning in higher education, in all of education. That's what that should say, not just higher education. And so specific suggestions that came out of this call were to make course objectives explicit. And I think we all have syllabi, we all have course objectives. We may call them learning outcomes, whatever we call them. And so those are embedded, but really it's so that faculty can focus on identifying what students are actually going to develop in a class towards their achievement. But that feedback should be a piece that gets embedded more regularly. And I can at least share my own personal experience. We probably all have this as well, right? Where you get an exam back or an assignment back and it just has a number on it and a whole bunch of red ink, right, to tell you what you did wrong, but there's no real understanding of, well, what could I have done to do it correctly, right? This piece of feedback is time consuming, it's intense, but this is a recommendation, right, that we need, as we assess students, we should be providing feedback. So this led us to reveal from a colleague of mine in the UK, he had developed this set of 6 guiding principles for sound assessment. And you can look very quickly. I've kind of highlighted some things in bold here. I'll just highlight those quickly, of thinking about, in terms of learning, having a series of logical steps, right? It's not just here's a thing, here's a point that you'll be assessed on, and then we move on to the next topic, right? So thinking about small units undertaken regularly versus trying to cover large amounts of material and then assessing on, that 500-point big assignment, right? Providing feedback, where there's prompts at each step of the learning process, embedding procedures that can be applied to new material and relate to that previous knowledge so that we're not teaching things as disparate siloed topics. making sure that students know what's expected of them. And then finally, that every student has an opportunity to reach a mastery level of performance. And you're going to see this, that this normally distributed piece is not necessarily, at least not my goal in my classes as I assess, right? But this oftentimes becomes a guiding principle to be able to rank students in the class. So what you can actually do with these principles is there are a lot of different names for a lot of different grading systems out there. These are ones that we have sort of used amongst our team. And when you start to look at these guiding principles, what you see is that these various different systems that have emerged over the last couple of decades or so, they tend to lean on a subset of these guiding principles, where traditional grading systems tend to lean on the right side of these 6 principles. And as you move towards what you're going to see on the continuum we've developed here in the next slide, some of these alternative systems that are focused more on student learning and feedback and components like that, they tend to lean on the guiding principles that fall on the left side of the 6 that are presented here. So where we see these guiding principles that drive assessment, we see sort of a divide here, where when you start to lean heavily on guiding principle 5 and 6, you tend to be more in a mindset of trying to select talent in the way that you are assessing students. Who's the best, right? And literally ranking students. Whereas as you start to leverage the guiding principles to the left side of the screen here, you're providing opportunities to help students develop, to fail. We talk about failure in engineering very, very often, right? But oftentimes in many of our classes, in the way that we assess, we don't provide students with that opportunity to fail. Literally, like, don't do well on an assignment, and then it doesn't ultimately affect their final grade, right? And that's where we're getting at here, is to try to lean more on this developing side of these guiding principles. So we created an assessment continuum. And here's how we sort of differentiate processes that are selecting talent versus developing talent. So when you lean on the right side of those guiding principles and on the right side of our continuum, you are aiming to differentiate and select talent. You are trying to maximize differences between students. It's for students, it can be difficult to contemplate what success means outside of just getting a bunch of points. What this can lead to is negative competition among students to get the best grade, right? And if you're trying to do this normal distribution, right, there's this possibility, right, that even students who are doing well and learning the content aren't getting grades that align with their learning, because you want to have a normal distribution in your class, right? And ultimately, not all students are going to achieve mastery. And in fact, you go in with the goal of that happening, that there are going to be students who are not going to master this content. And even with some of the approaches that are more focused on developing talent, not every student is going to master the content, but you're going in with the mindset that I'm going to work with these students to develop their talent, right? And so we're shifting that goal towards student talent development, providing direct measures of students' proficiency on those very clearly laid out learning outcomes, supplementing it with feedback. And it's not to say that the other systems don't also have feedback, but feedback being a crucial and key point. And I'm not going to talk about this today, but we've done some work where we actually assess students' use of the feedback that gets provided to them. And for many of us, we may feel, right, that we're giving this feedback and they never look at it. That's what some of our work was, is how they leverage that feedback. And then finally, that instructors can support student mastery, right? So it also takes us out of that mindset of being the sage on the stage in the way that we teach, to making it so that we feel more like a coach and advocate, and guiding students in their development and mastery of this content. So what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, and where my team fell, and actually some of the work that we're continuing to do right now is starting to shift more towards mastery based in what we're doing. But the work that we did a few years back was focusing on standards based grading. And we started with standards based grading, and this is where my story comes from, is this particular system gained a lot of popularity at the K-12 level here in the United States. And it actually became a thing for my team, because one of my colleagues went to his daughter's school. The teacher gave him her report card, and he, as someone who he's a full professor, been teaching for many years, looked at the teacher and said, "I don't know what I'm looking at." I don't understand this report card that you're giving me. He's just familiar with traditional grading systems. And as she started to explain it to him, he said, why am I not doing this in my classes in mechanical engineering and higher education? And so what you're going to see as a piece here, and we found a way to embed these things in Canvas and other learning management systems, is an opportunity for students to clearly see how they're developing in different learning outcomes within a course, providing multiple ways to provide feedback and multiple ways for students to see how they're progressing throughout the course. And so you can just see here, if I quickly highlight here 1.2, right, you can see, or actually let's look at 1.1, right? Students are generally demonstrating appropriate, but then we can see, right, that there was a jump here. They display strong performance. And that's a visual thing that students can see immediately, like, oh, wow, I started out at a pretty good level. Wow, I've developed more, right? And they can see that improvement in the way that they're being assessed. So what are the basic underlying principles of standards-based grading? Standards-based grading requires clear, meaningful, and personalized feedback. And you're sitting there going, oh God, you're just adding more work to my plate. We have identified systems, and GradeScope is a great example of a tool that you can use, right? Where as you start to find things that you want to provide feedback in, you can start to add that same feedback in over and over and over again to students. So it's personalized in that the students are having the same issue on a particular assignment, but you build out what that feedback is, so you're not having to type it in individually for every single student. It connects assessment to specific well-defined course objectives. You're going to see an example of my class here. You may all say, I'm doing that, but what I've done is done it very explicitly by making sure that when I assess, the students actually see the learning outcome, so that it's not just here are my objectives on the first day in my syllabus. No, they will see it every single time they get assessed. They will know exactly what that is. What we have revealed when talking with students is that they feel like this is more fair. There's more transparency. There is a learning curve for students to understand what the system is all about, but it also provides flexibility. And it promotes and encourages learning and continuous improvement. It moves away from that competitive component. Yes, students may still want to try to get the highest grade, but it does step away from that as being the focus. And for those who have to fill out FCARs like myself, a lot of my colleagues they struggle constantly with how do I pick out certain pieces from certain assignments to say that students have met XYZ ABET criteria. My entire class is actually set up so that all I have to do is just take out those individual pieces. You'll see it here in a second. And it takes me about 10 minutes to do all of my ABET FCAR work because I already know exactly which outcomes align to which ABET criteria. And now I have a better sense of that, as well as the students having that sense. The general flow is that you want to come up with well-defined course objectives. This is different for every class. The example I'm about to give you is in a project-based course that I teach. My colleagues are teaching statics courses, and so we found that there's a lot of flexibility and variability in terms of how you can implement this system. You have to find a way to make it fit for your own class. But there's many different ways to do this, and again, you'll see my example here in a second. You want to create a very clear course policy, as we all have in our syllabi, so that's no different. It's going to just be a little different than the norm, right? And so for me, I have found continually reminding students of this new system so that they are clear on it. And my hope with the integration of this type of system at the K-12, more and more students are going to come in with a comfort level with this system already. Rubrics are key, making sure that students understand how the ultimate grade that they get is aligned to the things that they're going to be asked to do, and then how it will ultimately impact their final grade. You'll see an example of that here in a second. And then having some sort of way to report this out. I'm going to show you how I do it in Google Docs, but ways to actually be able to have students be able to see their progress, of course, all the things that they're being assessed on throughout the semester. So here's my example. So as I noted, this is EGR 201. It's a project use-inspired design project course that we teach. And again, you all have these in your syllabi. You'll see at the beginning of each one of mine, I have an acronym, a short acronym, DBMSRTE. I've also identified the ABET. That's what helps me link this back later on. And what students will see, and you'll see an example here shortly, is that when I assess them, I don't just say it's out of 10 points. And here's all the things you're going to be assessed on. I say, this particular assignment is going to be worth 4 points for DB, for 6 points on M, for 4 points on S, and every assignment is some combination of all of these objectives. Only really the final assignment in the class assesses all of them, but throughout a given semester or project, right, you're going to assess them on different things on different assignments. And so you really just want to figure out what those underlying objectives are that you want to assess students on throughout the semester. And you come up with your policy. Now, I'm going to actually show you two examples of this. You're going to see a second example. In this particular example, the one that we've been using most recently, we put it on a 5-point scale from 0 to 4. This is where students can sometimes be thrown off a little bit because they're used to the 0 to 100. They understand what that means. As soon as a student receives a 3 on this scale, and they forget about the 0, by the way, they just think about it as a 4-point scale. As soon as they get a 3, they feel like they've gotten 75% and they feel like they have a C in the class, which is not the case for this class. As you can see in the policy below, getting a 3 gives you an A- in this course. So the grading system is designed to provide comfort for the students to feel like, oh, I don't need to be perfect to get an A in this class, right? As long as I'm at a general advanced level, right, meeting expectations, I can succeed in this class. And what we've seen in the student data that we have that I won't have time to present today is that that reduces that anxiety a little bit because they feel like it's far more attainable to get a good grade. It also, as we know, right, when you give students assignments, let's say you have 3 exams and they don't do well in the first exam, they immediately are like, now I can't get an A in this class, right? And that's not the design of this system or the way that we've set it up for this course. Then there's examples of rubrics. So in my class, I have a product archaeology component where they dissect a toothbrush. And so here is the rubric. And so what you see on this particular assignment that they're being asked to provide a sketch of how the toothbrush works internally before dissecting this thing. They're only being assessed on one of the learning objectives, modeling. It's very clear that they're being assessed on modeling. And then I give a very detailed description of the things that they're going to be asked to do this. So ultimately, this will go into their overall modeling score, which goes into something like this. So I purposefully show here, before I showed you a 0 to 4-point scale, here we're using a 0 to 3-point scale. So you have some flexibility in the number of points that you may use. And for me, I have projects. And so what I do is I do some sort of summation of projects. So first, what you see is that there's these individual assignments. That's what's on the rows. And so for the first assignment, I just, calling it design description, students were assessed on DB and on team working. All right. And that's what the design and build and team working are my objectives. And so those are my objectives in the columns. So you've got all your different scores within, it could be across a course, it could be within a project. Ultimately, it results in some sort of score that you can present to students, where now students are like, how did I do on the individual learning outcomes in this project or in this course? Right. And so students can see DB, there was only one piece, right? But here in modeling, they're doing pretty well on my scale from 0 to 3, right? And they get a better sense of how they're doing across the various components in the class, as opposed to just some omnibus number that's a compilation of all these things, where maybe they did really well in teaming and really bad in DB, but they still got an A, right? And so ultimately, this leads to some sort of point score that I can then translate into some sort of letter grade. And the only reason I bring it to that point is because I have to for ASU, right? And so that's the point to link it back. What I skipped over very briefly here is at the bottom, I actually weight some of these things in terms of their importance in the course to make sure that students understand the things that I'm trying to highlight more so than others. It's not that they're not all important. I want to make sure though that I weight that the different components of my course, and you can include this or not include this. It's kind of up to you. And we've played around with these numbers quite a bit. And you can do the same thing with weighting different components of the course. Things that you might do early on in the semester might be worth more than things you might do later on, or worth less early on than what you might do at the end of the semester, when you want to see students having responded to that feedback and improving upon their performance on these learning objectives that you have set for your class. All right. So we've done a whole bunch of research on this. And again, I only have really time to present one, and I'm going to focus on the faculty perceptions piece because I'm talking to faculty. And I'm going to pop this in the chat real quick is a link to our website with all the work that we've done. On this website, you're also going to see resources. We have a YouTube channel with some of the things that some of our participating teachers created to help navigate some of these systems. And then, of course, they're teaching different kinds of classes. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff. But we've also done some work looking at student perceptions of this whole system. We've looked at that piece that I mentioned around students' feedback, use of feedback. So trying to get a sense for faculty, right? Is it a waste of my time to give this feedback? How do students actually use that feedback? And then this piece that I'm going to break down a little bit for you around faculty perceptions of this system. So what we did was we asked participating faculty 3 open-ended questions, and we looked at salient utterances that were analyzed by 4 independent researchers. So what we've got here is a group of 85 faculty who engaged in this project in a variety of different ways, from individuals who attended one of our workshops and were just learning about this whole thing, and they hadn't actually implemented it yet, but based on just a cursory understanding, not unlike what you're all gaining right here today, what are your sort of feeling and sense of what might be beneficial, what might be gained from using this type of approach versus their more traditional approach? And then, of course, we have a subset of faculty who actually implemented this system, or a version of this system in their classrooms to get a sense of their feelings towards, and you're going to see the 3 questions towards using this sort of alternative system. And we threw this on a proficiency scale of looking at it essentially from novice to expert, right? In terms of people who have had a chance to implement and people who haven't quite had a chance. And I'll come back to that question, Ryan. So here's what generally emerged, and I'll draw your attention to various different parts of this table. So the things that were pretty consistent, regardless of whether teachers were novices or experts, when asking about what we thought, what do faculty think the perceived student gains are from using such a system. And what came out is that there's a clear understanding of the learning outcomes because they are repeated over and over again. There is this component of allowing students to do very clear self-evaluation of their assessment across the various different learning outcomes, that it improved transparency for students on what grading was, and that there's this feeling, this sense, and you see the novices didn't check this box because they hadn't had a chance to implement it yet, but that it placed the focus more on learning versus trying to earn a grade. And so those were really positive sort of outcomes in terms of the perceived student gains. We also saw, depending on at what point faculty were in implementing this, that some started to see like, oh, this system feels a little bit more closely related to how students might be assessed when they go into industry. So there's this great connection to potentially bring this to connect how they will be assessed in their future, right? Versus it being a very separate system. And that there's this feeling, at least going in and then in the first early implementation of there potentially being this lowering anxiety towards trying to get grades. Now, seeing blank spots doesn't necessarily mean that these other groups didn't feel the same way in terms of the perceived gains. They just didn't mention it when we asked them these open-ended questions. But this is what sort of emerged when just asking, generally speaking, what do you think the perceived gains are for students? We also recognize that anytime you make a change, and we all know change happens really slow in academia, but especially when you're making a change of this nature in terms of how you are assessing students in your classroom, there are obstacles that need to be overcome. And so again, I'll draw your attention to the top here first around the things that were pretty consistent across all the groups, regardless of at what point they were in implementing this. Number 1 was making sure you have buy-in. And so that can absolutely be one of those challenges where, hey, I'm doing this in my classroom. Another faculty member is like, why are you doing that? Why are you wasting your time? And then students being like, why? I've had students say this, like, why can't you just assess us normally? And so it usually happens early in the class. And once they get a sense of what it is and they understand how it's hopefully benefiting them, they usually change that initial perception. Obviously, there's workload. Anytime you make a change in any way, shape, or form in your classroom, there is a certain amount of workload. But again, just like anything else, I mean, I don't have to put any additional effort into this anymore because I took that initial time to invest that time to make this change. And now it's just streamlined every semester for me. There are potential concerns in terms of the consistency and the use of these types of systems. I don't necessarily see this as an obstacle because I'm okay with everyone making this their own, as people do with the traditional system, right? But sometimes when you're teaching a course like the one I'm teaching, where you have multiple different instructors teaching the same course, and then maybe potentially you have multiple graders or graduate TAs engaged. And in fact, this is another side study we did was to look at consistency across multiple raters. And so that's just one obstacle that you have to try to manage. And then, of course, managing all of this. And so when we started this, we were still in Blackboard. Then we got to Canvas. Canvas has an outcome feature, and so it's made it a little bit easier for us, but it's not perfect, any of these systems. And so how you manage these things, a lot of people have defaulted to using Google spreadsheets to share with students and doing posting IDs and things like that, but it is something to overcome. There's also a couple of additional things that emerged from some of our groups in terms of course fit and making sure that it aligns with the different kinds of courses, and then concerns about the implementation in terms of the lack of resources to be able to do such things. And you can see the different groups that sort of identified those potential obstacles. So the final thing we asked was just best practices, and obviously novices hadn't done it before, so they didn't have quite best practices, but just some things that emerged from this data in terms of, if you're going to try this, what would people recommend? And the top two here are map your learning objectives with your rubrics, and you saw that as the example that I showed, and making it very explicit in every assignment what students are being assessed on and mapping it back to that syllabus where you have those outcomes. The second one is we built a community, right? And that website is part of where that community lives. And so connecting with others who are implementing the system is obviously a way to improve your implementation. We also had a couple around trying to identify how you are going to manage this data, and then the ingraining and bringing in the feedback from students when you first try this. And I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here on that second bullet there. And then finally, reach out and talk to others, as we're doing here today, about what you're doing with this system. I've shared this story in other venues where, like, I left something relating to another thing I was doing in the photocopier, and someone brought it to me and said, "What is this?" Talking with others about it, because some of those obstacles that need to be overcome, that buy-in piece, if you start sharing with faculty what you're doing, they may say that's interesting, and potentially it leads to some changes. And then also taking some time to talk with students. And for me, I regularly remind students throughout the semester of what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, and why it hopefully is benefiting them, this shift. So overall, the general findings here are that there are obstacles. There's obstacles with any change you're going to make in your classroom, but generally speaking, these can be overcome with best practices. And it all leads to a benefit for students. And for us, it's making a shift, right? We're making this shift by using these types of approaches. It doesn't have to be standards-based grading. It could be those adaptive, mastery-based approaches that we're also on that continuum. But all of this is getting us, the faculty, shifting our mindsets away from trying to select talent towards approaches that are directed towards developing all of our students. And I think, especially at a place like ASU, as an access institution with the mission that we have as part of our charter, this is critical for us to be able to have systems in place when we are assessing students to make sure that we are in the classroom not trying to weed students out based on their grades, but that we're developing that talent, and that students can then reflect back and understand the things that they learned and the things that they didn't learn. This, by the way, is also awesome to share with. So in my case, I teach a course that there's a follow-up course, right? In this design spine we have. I share these grades with the faculty teaching those classes. They can see where students have thrived and where students have struggled to potentially make changes to their own class. So it all kind of creates a really strong system approach to assessing students throughout their 4 years of education. Again, getting everyone to buy in, that's the challenge. All right, with that, I thank you. I did pretty good here, Lindy. I went 38 minutes, which was pretty good for having not presented this in a little bit.